makers of American food want a bite of the Chinese market, which has more than 1 billion mouths to feed. But the trade war between the world's two largest economies is spoiling their prospects.
Our tariffs went up 25%, but we haven't passed that on to our consumers yet. We're absorbing the cost together with our dealers and sellers. We're hanging in here, but we hope trade tensions can be resolved soon.
The dispute went up a notch this past week when both the US and China imposed new tariffs. Washington says it plans to slap import taxes on everything it buys from China. Beijing has responded with tariffs of its own. It's also stopping purchases of major US exports like aircraft and soybeans. Despite the escalation, US President Donald Trump says negotiations are continuing.
We are in a very, very strong position. They want to make a deal. It could absolutely happen. But in the meantime, a lot of money is being made by the United States.
Trump's statement has raised hopes the US and China could sign a deal soon. That's ahead of next month's G20 summit in Japan, where Trump could meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
I doubt they could reach an agreement by then. It's more likely that the two presidents meeting would start a new round of serious negotiations, and maybe a month or two after that. To me, best case scenario is sometime over the summer the two sides reach an agreement and we pull back from this escalating trade war.
Washington's biggest beef is the U.S. trade deficit with China. Last year, the U.S. bought $540 billion worth of goods from China. China imported just $120 billion of products from the U.S. Trump says until there's a major change, tariffs will stay. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Well, let's get more on the story now with Maurizio Zanardi, a professor of international economics at Lancaster University. Welcome to Money Talks, Maurizio. What do you make of Donald Trump's attempt to downplay this trade war, which he himself has escalated and could even escalate it even further?
Well, he can try to downplay it maybe for the domestic audience, but it is a full-blown trade war, and his recent tweets are only inflaming the situation further. By threatening to cover all imports from China with tariffs, this is an escalation that is unprecedented. And it's not a minor squabble. Here we are talking of a major trade war that affects not only China and the United States, but all countries in the world, because the world is so interconnected and globalized when it comes to production and trade flows. And consumers and firms are paying the cost of this trade war. It is not the case that China is paying billions of dollars into the coffers of the United States. It is in large part US consumers and US producers that are paying the price.
And as you say, both the US and China are being impacted by this trade war, but who do you think is worse off?
Well, in relative terms, you may say that China is worse off economically speaking, but then the question is not only the short-term, but the medium and long-term effects. So the fall in the stock markets in the US from some measure is as large, if not even more, than the total trade deficit that the United States has with China. Is it worth to have a tweet that sends the markets in such a rapid descent? What are the prospects afterwards? Because the stock markets react on the news, on the Twitter, but decisions, investment decisions and trade partners are shaped by long-term considerations. And what would be my long-term consideration if I was the CEO of an American company or of a Chinese company or a Turkish company and I have to decide about my investment strategies? How can I forecast what the trade relationships and trade protectionism will be in, let's say, 6 months, 1 year or 2 years' time?
And perhaps in an example of China faring worse is just the latest retail sales figures and industrial output data that's just come out of Beijing. They show that they're quite disappointing in the last quarter, but do you think that Beijing then is in a weaker bargaining position compared to the US?
I think, as I said before, maybe China in relative terms is losing more. I'm not sure it's in a weaker bargaining position, because here we don't have only to consider the economic cost, but the political and diplomatic situation. China cannot be perceived to be losing, and therefore they will implement retaliation even if it is costly to them. But if you think in the medium term, President Trump is facing elections next year. China is not facing election or any real elections anytime soon. So maybe the politicians, the president of China, can afford more domestic economic pain than what President Trump can do, because he has the ballot box to look towards. So it's a very difficult question, and we should not only think in terms of economic cost, but more broadly political consideration and strategic consideration that involve global matters.
Interesting. Now, as we heard in Paolo's story, Donald Trump has confirmed that he plans to meet the Chinese President Xi Jinping at the G20 summit in Tokyo next month. Do you expect anything significant to come from that meeting?
I hope, because at this point the meetings that took place in Washington between the two negotiating teams cannot resolve the blocks that they seem to be existing between the two sides. It must be that a general framework agreement is found between the two presidents, and then they can delegate the details to the negotiating teams. But we cannot have a situation where we are all expecting to be on the verge of a trade agreement to be signed, for a Twitter to come along and then everything disrupted. There must be a clear understanding at the top level of both countries and sign in principle the deal, so that then the negotiators can go ahead and do the nitty-gritty work.
Okay, meanwhile, on another front, Donald Trump has until Friday midnight Washington time to decide whether or not to impose tariffs on EU car imports. Do you think he'll go ahead with that?
I don't know. Maybe we'll talk next week again. This is really at the time of a crystal ball. On the one hand, how many front, if we think again of the analogy with the war, how many front can you open at one time? How many enemies can you have, can you create at one single moment? Because then the enemy of my enemy will maybe become my friend, or vice versa on the other side. The EU is another fundamental trade partner with the United States. It has tremendous power to inflict pain on US consumers and firms, although that will also come at the cost of pain and money for producers and consumers in the European Union. I honestly don't know. I think that President Trump should think very carefully about his next moves when it comes to trade policy.
Okay, Maurizio Zanardi, we will have to leave it there, but thank you so much again for your analysis.